This is goldsmiths minting coins. And, they would keep people's gold for safekeeping, and people didn't really like carrying this heavy gold around. It was heavy and it was unsafe. And so the goldsmiths would issue these pieces of paper, these banknotes they were called, that were actually receipts for the gold. And then they discovered that that people would want to borrow these notes, and they discovered that they could actually issue 10 times as many notes as they had gold, because people only came for their gold about 10% of the time. And that's the basis of our 10% reserve requirement that we still use today, the fact that people only come for their money 10% of the time. So it's a fraud, actually. It's counterfeit money. The Bank of England was founded in 1694, again, to fund a war. It was a war of William and Mary. And they did the same thing. They paid with paper banknotes that were many times the amount of gold they actually had. And the Bank of England's paper notes eventually became the national currency. So we followed that plan. Jefferson was Hamilton's political rival, and he was always highly suspicious of this system. But at first, he, like all the other founding fathers, thought that the fault was that it was paper money. He said, "I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution, taking from the federal government the power to borrow money. I now deny their power of making paper money or anything else a legal tender." That was in 1798. But later, he figured out that it wasn't what the money was made out of. It was who issued it that was the problem. He said in 1815 in a private letter, "The Treasury, lacking confidence in the country, delivered itself bound hand and foot to bold and bankrupt adventurers and bankers, pretending to have money, whom it could have crushed at any moment." He wrote in another letter, "Although we have so foolishly allowed the field of circulating medium to be filched from us by private individuals, I think we may recover it. The states should be asked to transfer the right of issuing paper money to Congress in perpetuity." Of course, that didn't happen, but Jefferson was instrumental in getting the charter for the first U.S. bank was not renewed, but then at that time Nathan Rothschild was the head of the banking business in England, and he said, or he is alleged to have said, that if we didn't renew the charter, that we'd find ourselves in another war with England. And sure enough, we had the War of 1812, which had no real political basis. And to fund that war, we did then charter the second U.S. bank. But Andrew Jackson was another great enemy of the banks, and he was highly suspicious of it. So he shut it down in the 1830s and took the money out. But after that, all we had was wildcat banks. We didn't have any national currency, or we just had banknotes from individual banks that might or might not really have the money. So Lincoln also found himself facing a war. As soon as he got into office, there he was involved in a war with no money to fund it. And so he went to the British bankers, or the Wall Street bankers, and who were backed by England, and they were offering loans at 24 to 36% interest, very high rates. And so he knew that was usurious, and that would quickly bankrupt the North. And that was the whole idea. They wanted to bankrupt the North. So he said, "Thanks, but no thanks," and he issued his own money. The man that recommended that, he said, will they accept this paper money? And I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name. He said, well, they'll have to. It's legal tender. He said, if you market legal tender and you issue it, they'll just, if you say it's honored everywhere in the country, then it will trade as money. And sure enough, it worked brilliantly well. Not only did the North win the war, but during the period of the Civil War, we had more expansion and productivity than we'd ever had before. They built railroads all the way across the country and did things for agriculture and education, and because they had the money to do it. So these were the greenbacks, the first government-issued money it was similar to what the colonists had done, and it hadn't been done up till then. But the British bankers were opposed to it, of course, and they said privately, "The great debt that capitalists will see to it is made out of the war must be used as a means to control the volume of money. To accomplish this, the bonds must be used as a banking basis. It will not do to allow the greenback, as it is called, to circulate as money any length of time, as we cannot control that." They wanted the money to be backed by government bonds or debt to the banks. By then, the British banking industry was dominated by the Rothschilds, the Rothschild family. The patriarch of the Rothschild family was Amschel Rothschild, and he said in 1791, a famous statement, "Let me issue and control a nation's currency, and I care not who makes its laws." That was their goal, to control nations by creating the currency. So they were instrumental in getting the National Bank Act passed in 1863. It was the forerunner of the Federal Reserve Act. It allowed private banknotes to become the national currency. In another private communication, they said, "The few who understand the system will either be so interested in its profits or so dependent upon its favors that there would be no opposition from that class, while on the other hand, a great body of people, mentally incapable of comprehending, will bear its burdens without complaint." So that's what we still have. That system led to a series of bank runs because the banks didn't actually have enough gold to cover all their paper banknotes. And so every time the depositors would figure that out or get suspicious of a bank, they'd all pile in at the same time to try to get their money out, and the bank wouldn't have the money, and so it would have to close its doors. So that happened all through the 19th century. And then there was a particularly bad bank run in 1907. And so J.P. Morgan spearheaded the push to backstop these bank runs with a banker's bank. Actually, there's pretty good evidence that he caused that bank panic in 1907. So that worked. They got their Federal Reserve Act passed, and it authorized the Federal Reserve to print paper banknotes called Federal Reserve notes and to buy government bonds with them, and those banknotes are our national currency. That would have been all right if the Federal Reserve were actually federal, but of course it isn't. It's owned by all the banks there are 12 different Federal Reserve banks, and they're all owned by the individual member banks in the community. For instance, the New York Federal Reserve is owned by about 500 member banks. Carroll Quigley, who was professor of history at Georgetown University and was Bill Clinton's mentor, he wrote in Tragedy and Hope in 1966, "The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans. In 1924, the chairman of the board of the Midland Bank said, 'Banks can and do create money, and they who control the credit of the nation direct the policy of government.'" So the Rothschild plan was working. The Federal Reserve Act was passed supposedly to backstop bank runs, but it obviously didn't work because we had the biggest bank run in history in 1933. So Franklin Roosevelt, knowing he had to do something, took the dollar off the gold standard. At that time, the dollar was 40% backed by gold, so that meant every time somebody came to the bank with $2 and got their gold out, $3 worth of loans had to be recalled. And because we were in a depression and everybody was worried about the banking system, they were all cashing in their dollars for gold. So it was collapsing the currency, and it would quickly have resulted in a serious lack of money if he hadn't taken the dollar off the gold standard. So he did.